Hi everyone, my name is Jonathan and welcome to today's TRI lecture of Chinese Ideologies Part 1. Before we get into the content today, I would just like to mention that Chinese Ideologies will be the first episode of our new upcoming humanities series, which is history. We hope you can keep on supporting us by watching our videos as we embark on this new journey. Now, without further ado, let's go into our first ideology. One of the first ideologies we'll be talking about today is Confucianism, which has existed in society for thousands and thousands of years, and it has had influence not only in just Eastern culture, but also in Western culture as well. Now, obviously, it's really hard to try and combine thousands and thousands of years of nuance into one Google slide, but in order to introduce Confucianism, we need to first talk about Confucius, which is its founding figure and its central figure. So, Confucius was born to a family of decent social status. His father was a military general, and because of this, he was able at a young age to be the front row seat of a lot of different Chinese rituals and a lot of traditions. With this, he developed a curiosity for culture, which manifested even more when he took a job as a small government official later when he grew up. With this job, he was able to travel to all different places around China, got to meet all different kinds of people, observe all different kind of cultures, and know all different kind of rulers. With this, later when he grew old, he decided to bring all of these life experiences he got from his life and then decided to settle down and become a teacher. All of his teachings and the discussions he had with the students were overall later compiled by the students into writings such as the Analects, and later this trickled down to today as what we know as Confucianism. So, it's obviously really hard to put thousands and thousands of years of thinking and philosophy into one Google slide, but if we were to introduce Confucianism and put like a basic starter pack, it would be said that the three main pillars of Confucianism can be compiled into power, education, and family. Obviously, so the first is just power. You would see before Confucian thought, whether in Eastern hemisphere or even in Western cultures, you would see that rulers didn't really have to bow down to their people. In this sense, I mean that rulers did not have to go through their people or get any of their people's permission in order to do certain actions. For example, start a war or build a wall. So, what Confucius decided to propose and decided to overturn is that rulers were to be benevolent and just with their power, meaning that rulers are actually there to serve the people instead of the other way around, and instead that the rulers have to really understand and do the actions for the people. And the second pillar of Confucianism is education. So you would see again, like the world before Confucianism, you would see that the social status and classes inside Eastern culture was extremely solid in the sense that it was hard for people to move up and down the social ladder. And what this means is that probably the rich can find ways to maintain their social status while the poor cannot find ways to get to a higher state. Now, this is really important. What Confucius brought there and proposed is that he's argued that education should be a tool that helps people discover and understand themselves. So education is not only a way for a person to not only broaden their knowledge base, but also what Confucius brings in is this type of philosophical knowledge that people can also use education to become more aware of their own beings, but also be more clear as to what they really want in life. So it's also good to take a look at another perspective to look at education, especially in our nowadays educational system, where it's just we're forced to study subjects and then get tests. What really is education is probably another question Confucius would have posed. But then third of all, and probably the most well-known one in Confucianism, is family. All of us probably have heard the term filial piety, or it's known as xiao in Mandarin. So what does this really mean? It's one of the key relationships that Confucius talked about, which is the child normally has to be really respectful to the parents. And you can still see this even in modern day Eastern cultures, that children are normally expected to continue supporting their parents even when they grow old, and you would see them still living in the same household even when the children have grown to a certain age. And this is really important and probably a pretty controversial or a topic that can be debated, but filial piety is the whole idea of Confucianism that family should always stay together and that the children has to be supportive of the past generations and vice versa. Now, how does this really impact society? So there's been so much impact of Confucianism into society, so I divided it up into two spectrums. The first is on political ideals. So the first in political ideals would be meritocracy. Like I said before, that it was really hard for people to be moving around social statuses or different social classes without Confucianism. And what Confucianism proposed, along with its emphasis on education, is that people should be able to earn their place in a higher ground in society. Therefore, they created the system of meritocracy, meaning that if a person does well on an exam, or a person does well or achieves something great in society, then they should be able to gain a higher class. And second of all is this increased emphasis on education. Again, this is just saying Confucius talked about how people really need education to broaden themselves, but also increase a general awareness of the environment, which is probably one of the reasons why everyone's forced to go to school today. And then the third of all is the heightened expectations for rulers. Now, I know that Western philosophers generally probably did not know of Confucius, and I do not know this, would have to fact check later, but what I would argue is that a lot of type of democratic republics that you see nowadays probably would have been influenced by Confucian ideals, considering the fact that its whole system is built on a basis for the people, which is probably one of the big values that Confucius talked about, meaning that there should be mutual respect between the rulers and the people, which is a really important thing. Now, onto the other spectrum, which is everyday life. There are two key points. First of all, preserved importance of etiquette. So, like I said before about filial piety, those are one of the key relationships that Confucius talked about. What he talks about is that there should always be an inferior and a superior party in all types of relationships. For example, an older brother and a younger brother, and maybe a ruler and its subject, and that there should always be mutual respect and etiquette between the way people interact. So, in Mandarin, we call this li, but moreover, in Western ideal, it would just be the idea of etiquette, but also a type of seriousness in between official or formal relationships. And second of all, another way he influenced everyday life is this rooted influence of family dynamics. Now, this is really important, especially if you take a look at Western ideals, is that in a lot of Asian culture or Asian countries, you would see that children will still live with their parents even after maybe they come of age or they become older than 18, which probably would make you a meme if you're in Western society, but instead in Asian family dynamics, it's actually an honorable thing to do because you're taking care of your parents who have taken care of you and raised you. Now, one of the key points I was trying to discuss when thinking about how to make this series and how to make this series really special is how does this relate with Western values? Now, this did take some time to come up with, but overall I think there are two key differences between what Confucianist belief brought up and what Western beliefs advocate for. So, first of all is that Confucian views of power dynamics are reflected in many Western democracies. Like I said before, the type of idea that Confucius brought in is that this idea of the people should not be serving the government, but instead the government is there to serve the people. And now you see in democratic countries, for example, the United States, with elections of people choosing who they want to be their next leader. And remember, the key word here is leader instead of ruler. Instead, what Confucius advocated for probably was not a huge reform as to what we see nowadays in democratic countries, but in a state that the ruler must keep the people in mind and the ruler must take action with the people in their long-term plans. And second of all is this idea of Confucian culture of family and group identities reinforced in the idea of collectivity, while Western ideals promote individualism. So there's actually a lot of studies you can find on the internet about this, but there's a big contrast between Eastern culture and Western culture. What you would normally find in Eastern ideals is that there's generally much more collectivity between groups, whereas in Western culture, people are more encouraged to be themselves and be individualistic. It's going to be really hard to identify which part is better. There's obviously benefits and negatives for both sides, but what you would see is that in Eastern culture, this idea of group, this idea of family, and this idea of friends and social circles are much more rigid and much more emphasized upon, whereas in Western culture, people are often told, oh, just be yourself, and then just let your own colors shine. All these kind of ideals have different contrasts and they have their own specialties and their benefits. So it's just one of the really funny, not really funny, but interesting contrasts that I observed when researching this lecture. So let's talk about the second ideology we're going to be talking about today, which is legalism. You see that I put a ... right before legalism because it's not necessarily probably the most popular or the most welcoming type of ideology. It's normally stigmatized because it advocates for some pretty interesting ideas. Now, to talk about legalism, we also have to talk about another crucial thinker we have to introduce, and this person is Han Fei, or sometimes known as Han Feizi. So he was part of a ruling family of one of the small city-states during the Warring States period of China. What you need to know about this background information is that the Warring States of China was one of the most chaotic periods during history, where people and states were constantly fighting each other to try and gain centralized power. Now, originally Han was under an influence of Confucianist beliefs, which is exactly the ideology we just introduced. But what Han observed during this idea of chaos is that Confucianism isn't really going to solve anything. In order to bring back order to society, he needed to create a new belief, which is why he decided to record his own ideals through writing, and in his central belief, he observed that people do not have their best interests in mind, as in people are either too stupid for their own interest, and that, like, in the most simple ground is that humans are inherently bad. So what he would argue the only way to bring order back to society is if a ruler was installed and that ruler would not have to listen or obey to any of the people. And this is the only way that the government can stop people from conducting immoral actions. One of the pretty central beliefs is that the government does not have to try to make the people better, but instead the government just have to make sure that the people don't do bad things. So this is a reason why legalism probably is not the most popular ideal, because it's a little tyrannical if you really think about it, but in times of chaos, maybe that is exactly what a country needs. After talking about the thinkers, we need to talk about what really is legalism. So overall, it's again really hard to compile legalism into just one Google slide, but overall, there are two key things about legalism. So, first of all, it's a socio-political system built to combine people's greed with the state's interests. Like I said before, Han believed that humans were inherently bad and greedy creatures. Who knows if he's right? So what he argued is that a political system needs to succeed if it takes in account of people's greed. So what he had proposed is that there should be a system built to combine people's greed along with the state's interest. For example, what he believed would have made a country much more richer is through a better military and better agricultural, maybe harvest. So what he would propose is that people should be awarded if they create a good harvest, or maybe if they fight a good war, or if they lead an army to success. Therefore, this system is a kind of meritocracy, but instead it's built so that the people are rewarded for making sure that the state gets successful or gains success. And second of all, another key idea of legalism is this establishment of rankings and social political stratifications. So it's kind of relating to what we said back in Confucianism, but instead it's kind of reinforcing the social statuses and the social classes. So what legalism talked about is if this person does well and if this person constantly achieves well, then maybe his family would gain extra benefits, or he would be awarded with a much higher social class, which sounds pretty fair, but in the long term, it would take some thought to think if this really is the best system. Again, how does this really impact society? So obviously, the way Han designed for this idea to be implemented is that it should be an idea strictly for political systems and for the government. Therefore, we would only have to look at a spectrum of political ideals. So, there are three key things that I came up with. The first is the importance of power for rulers and superiority. What Han argued is that in times of crisis, the ruler should not have to listen to anyone, but the ruler should have the full power to make sure that people are controlled and the state is actually centralized into one unified ruler. Now, if you think about this, in the past, historically, we have seen ideas like this. For example, in World War II, FDR, which is the president at the time, Roosevelt, he didn't have to go through another re-election. He was elected 3 terms, which is against the rules, but probably was what America needed at the time, which is one ruler to rule them throughout the entire World War. The second ideal is social political classes. Like I said before, Han argued that political classes and this rise through rankings should be needed as an incentive for people to be doing well and benefiting the state. And last of all is strict laws. Extending upon the first idea of the importance of rulers and superiority, Han, you can see at this point, is that he advocated for an ideal where the government should be having a huge bundle of power over the people, as in there should be a lot of strict laws to make sure that the people are not doing bad. Again, it comes back to legalism's central belief of it's not there to make the people good nor listen to the people. It's just there as like a police to make sure that the people are not doing any bad, and that's the core value of legalism. Now, again, how does this really connect with Western values? Because you would see that Western values normally stems in the past, like Socrates and Plato talking about this idea of democracy and creating a republic for the people. Now, how does this really connect with Western values? So, one of the first connections I made, thank you Ms. Ree for teaching me this in AP Euro, is Machiavellian theories. If you know, Niccolo Machiavelli was a Renaissance thinker in Western values. And then what he advocated for when he wrote in a writing The Prince is that there should be a ruler that do not have to listen to the people and should have full power over the state. This is pretty much similar to legalism, but in the sense that Machiavelli just wrote this into making sure that there should be only one centralized ruler and one centralized power that overrides anything. But Han was written in a different time background and in a different culture, as in that he was advocating for this purely because of his rooted influence of chaos in the Warring States period. And second of all, this is probably one of the most interesting political debates of all time, but it's this idea of democracy versus legalism. Now, it's obviously not able for me to cover centuries and centuries of the debate for one of the biggest clash, but it's one of the biggest counter-arguments towards democracy and this idea of handing the government into the people. This originally was brought up by Socrates, who said that democracy is purely stupid because maybe if there was a majority who is uninformed or uneducated to make a right decision, then democracy suddenly becomes a tyranny of the majority. Now, have we seen this happen in history? I don't know. The 2016 elections, maybe not. We never know. But it's one of the biggest questions in history is democracy fundamentally a good system if the majority is granted too much power, or should we have legalism instead where there is one major ruler who rules over all? Well, maybe democracy can lead to legalism, so many other things that we cannot explore, but what we can know after all is that democracy and legalism are fundamentally different political theories, but which one is fundamentally better, it has to all depend on the situation, and it really has to depend on what type of country or what kind of setting you're putting it in. So in summary, we discussed two key ideologies today. The first is Confucianism, which advocated for this idea that rulers have to be benevolent, and then family values ensuring collectivistic values, and also this idea of reinforcing education. Whereas in legalism, you would see this idea of one centralized ruler and one ruler that is there only to purely prevent the people from doing bad actions instead of making the people better. Which system is better? I don't know. Drop your comments or drop your thoughts down in the comment sections below. Overall, I want to thank everybody for attending today's lecture, and we hope to see you in future videos.